The past and present wilt, I have filled them, emptied them, and proceed to fill my next fold of the future. Listener up there, what have you to confide to me? Look in my face while I snuff the siddle of evening. Talk honestly, no one else hears you, and I stay only a minute longer. Do I contradict myself? Very well then, I contradict myself. I am large, I contain multitudes. I concentrate toward them that are nigh, I wait on the door slab. Who has done their day's work? Who will soonest be through with their supper? Who wishes to walk with me? Will you speak before I am gone? Will you prove already too late? That was Walt Whitlam's piece, I am large, I contain multitudes, and Louka and I felt that it speaks to, in a sense, a fragment or a fractal of our conversation, being that we are multidimensional. We do contain multitudes, and we often forget our nature. And in this conversation, Louka is someone who I've admired his work in really bringing Indigenous wisdom and systems thinking to the education space and to the future of leadership and the future of learning. And how can we, I suppose, design learning systems that acknowledge our multidimensionality and the wholeness of who we are, essentially. If we are to thrive personally and collectively, and of course they're so entwined in the 21st century, then we are asked to unlearn and relearn ways of knowing and being that are more congruent with our ecologies and the natural systems we're a part of. And we're also asked to remember and honor the wisdom of our Indigenous cultures as we look for ways of belonging together, not only with each other as human animals, but also to the more than human world. Something that many of our Indigenous cultures did very, very well. And when I say Indigenous cultures, I by no means am, I suppose, trying to fit them all under one label. There's such a diversity in Indigenous cultures, and many of them had these ways of belonging together with human and more than human worlds. And so in this episode, Louka and I explore what it means to broaden our epistemologies, or our ways of knowing, to take responsibility for our own journey of unlearning and relearning as leaders and stewards, differentiating identity and character, and how, I suppose, allowing our identity to be a little bit malleable and changeable, but rooting in a sense of character and really discerning the difference. And what the power of questions offer us in ways of disrupting our mental models that guide our thinking, feeling, and behaving in the world. So this really is a brilliant conversation to touch on many of the brilliant invitations for us as leaders, as stewards of culture in this time, as learners and as unlearners, as constant becomers in this time, and how we might, in some very practical ways as well, start this process or continue this deepening process of unlearning and constantly becoming, to include more of the wholeness of who we are, and start to design systems, structures, and relationships to be more totalizing of the human condition. So enjoy, and we trust and really do hope that this adds some brilliant insights and tools to your toolkit for becoming a real steward of wholeness in this time. Grab a tea, take a breath, notice the inhale, the exhale, and the space between. A moment in between moments. Here you are. You're listening to Spaces Between with your friend and host, L. Jeffrey. An open exploration into restoring connection in the 21st century in our personal lives, our relations, and our communities. What does it mean to live in relationship to the wholeness of who we are together? I'm not one for ads and am one for creating something beautiful with others, in this case, you. So if you enjoy our time together, I do invite you to subscribe on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, rate and leave a review for the show. And if you're feeling super generous and fueled and filled up by our conversations, you might even consider donating or soon joining my Patreon membership. Just visit www.spacesbetweenpodcast.com, where you'll also find show notes and other useful links and resources following these conversations. So this is it. Let's dive in. Louka, thanks for taking the time for a podcast conversation with me this morning.
I'm really excited for where we end up and the ideas we explore.
Yeah. Maybe we'll begin just by really landing in where we are before we start journeying to where we're going to go. I'm wondering if you could verbally paint us a picture of where you're joining from.
Great. Well, I would say Nina Mani from Ghana Yarta. So that's hello from Ghana country here in South Australia. Beautiful South Australia, in southern Adelaide, in fact. I'm currently on my family farm, my mum's farm. So we have 10 acres here, surrounded by trees, bees, olive trees, chickens, a rooster that we might hear in the background during this conversation. And this has been where I have landed previously, effectively being a global nomad and traveling quite a lot. Well, effectively traveling was the default state for the last 18 months before March 2020. But yeah, I'm really grateful. This is a beautiful part of the world. We're 60 seconds from the beach. It's just I get to go down there and watch sunsets and run through the Scrub Conservation Park and, every now and then scare a few kangaroos and joeys. I saw some joeys yesterday. It's just a really lovely part of the world to be, particularly with so many things happening and so much, I would say, mass uncertainty, which can manifest as anxiety for everybody, which is, of course, completely understandable. So yeah, I work from here now. This is the home office that we set up in the first few months, knowing that, okay, well, it doesn't look like any of these flights will take place. So yeah, I've spent hundreds and thousands of hours in this particular spot. But yeah, luckily doing really what I consider anyway, really meaningful work with some wonderful people.
Yeah. Lovely. Yeah, I'm just admiring the beautiful piece of Indigenous artwork behind you. And obviously those listening won't be able to see it and admire it as well. But I'm wondering if you would share a little bit about it.
Sure. That's it's probably the nicest thing I own, both sentimentally and aesthetically, right? It's this wonderful articulation of Mimili. And Mimili is a community in the Anangu, Pitjantjatjara, Yankunytjatjara lands, also called the APY lands for short. And it's part of Australia that actually sits in our Western paradigm anyway, on the border of South Australia, Western Australia, and South Australia in the Northern Territory. And it's part of this tri-state border region. And Mimili is one of the communities there where Anangu, which is the cultural group, and Pitjantjatjara and Yankunytjatjara, which are the kind of main languages of that particular area in South Australia. It's where I first became a teacher. So the artist passed away about 18 months ago, but Ms. Pulmani was a wonderful educator and an incredible artist. And this represents the area around Mimili. So all of these are kind of rocks. And I just loved her style and also her character more than anything else. It's an absolute, wild card, really dynamic, charismatic, and straddled, of course, incredible, deep time and deep knowledge from the Anangu culture and her ancestry, and then also the way that she interacted with kind of the emerging concept of Australia in terms of her engagement, 32 years at the school, being a co-principal and other things. And I actually was very lucky to work with her daughter as co-principals as well for a period there. So, yeah.
Yeah. Lovely. It sounds like a really beautiful intersection of what I've anyway witnessed as, two very strong threads of your work, which is education and really, I suppose, creating environments that nurture the minds of our current and future leaders and ancient wisdom, and bringing in maybe more totalizing perspectives of the human condition and living in relationship with country. So it sounds like, just hearing you share the story, a really beautiful intersection of two of the threads that I at least witness very present in your work.
Well, I think you put that so beautifully and more articulately than I ever would, and probably do me too much credit. But it has certainly been my learning journey. Spending 5.5 years as a teacher and then subsequently as a school principal, a leader and then a school principal, in that central part of Australia, this incredible, beautiful ancient land in which we find ourselves. It didn't just shift my views on schooling or education or learning. They shifted my entire paradigm of belief, values, the kind of ontology, right? The epistemology, like what is knowledge? What is learning? What is belonging? What is identity? These are really massive questions, as you're trying to write a lesson plan and run into the staff room and do your yard duty and all these other tasks, and we were quite a philosophical group when I was there, definitely. We're trying to do the quite practical aspects, but also go back to first principles and think a lot about, well, what is this school for? Because we're nested in this kind of community here and we weren't introducing education in any sense, tens of thousands of years of continuous exchange and exploration of knowledge, very deeply connected to land. And so I went there very much as a novice, and I myself had quite an education, I would suggest. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And I suppose it brings me to a question around, and I mean, it's a forever living inquiry, but your perspective on wholeness and what it means to live in relationship with our ecologies, with each other, with something maybe more than human. What is your perspective of wholeness? What does it mean to you?
Well, that's a great question. I have to put a caveat. And the caveat is whatever I say right now will likely be different in 3 months' time. And I hope it is, frankly, because I try to hold a humility about any perspective that I might hold. And I fully expect to be changed by our conversation, Al, to walk away different than the human being I walked in with. So that's my caveat, is that this is always going to be an incomplete and emerging perspective. I would suggest that if we look at the way that we've structured society, particularly as part of the different industrial revolutions, and we find ourselves now in the fourth industrial revolution, some commentators put like Klaus Schwab from the World Economic Forum and others, we have been very successful at some parts of the human condition, particularly ones that, standardize, that increase efficiencies, incredible inventions and patents, across medicine, engineering, manufacturing, just so many incredible things, right? And I wonder if by doing that and creating all of these different metrics and measurements and, we have become obsessed with quantification. It's like if you can't measure it, then, we don't focus on it. It's quite literally, it's no longer a frame for our work. If it's not in the framework, it is not in the frame for our work, quite literally, right? So my suggestion is that the offer is that we need to rediscover wholeness. And it's not necessarily thinking, remembering as opposed to finding, In my work with young people, for example, I don't use the word, you just have to find your passion. I think that's just a bizarre concept, You kind of need to explore or discover. And it's as much about an inward journey as an outward kind of experimentation approach, I think. So if we can overcome the self-delusion that we have, it's Tom Oliver's book, which I recommend to all of you listeners, I read recently. We have kind of thought for the past few centuries that it is the individual that matters as a functional unit of economic activity, but also around liberation and freedom. And so what I'm interested in is how do we rediscover the fact there is no such thing as an individual without another? It's only by contrasting and compare. And all my work as an applied linguist, a word is completely arbitrary, and it's only the fact that there is this kind of a shared understanding between more than one person. There's another that the words I'm speaking right now even make any sense as they transfer from, my brain to my mouth across technology through your ears into your brain. So I'm just really interested in that idea. It's how do we create wholeness in all of our social structures? In neighborhoods from a cityscape perspective, certainly from educational perspectives, we have been very good at carving things into, again, functional times based on an industrial model that looks more like a factory than like an organic community or an indigenous culture sitting around a campfire. So that's, I think, our great challenge, and particularly using this moment of disruption. How might we rediscover wholeness? Educationally, that means, considering and treating all children as whole children. From a neighborhood perspective, it's how do we integrate neighborhoods so that people feel deeply connected and belonging, and not just for humans, but for all living things, the ecological approach. When we think about economics, it means taking us away from really narrow metrics that have been useful to some extent, like GDP, and moving towards things like social prosperity or livability, or societal well-being. And so I think these are the shifts that we're seeing across all of these different models, which is wonderful. Even in medicine, from pathology to flourishing or thriving. And, the way moving away from this pathological focus towards one that looks about what is our greatest collective expression as a species? And how do we leverage that incredible creativity and innovation to, I don't want to sound cliche, but quite literally to change our world for the better, to make sure that we are acting, within our planetary bounds, but also, to paraphrase the donut economic model by Kate Raworth, ensuring that we have a social foundation for every single person on the world. And we can achieve that now. It's not that we need more technology to do so. It's that we need to shift the way we consider our wholeness as a global species.
Yeah, so many threads I'd love to pull apart. I suppose one that's just alive now is really we spoke about mental models in our short conversation before we clicked record. And yeah, the kind of adaptability that is required personally as being maybe sacred activists or stewards of change, leaders that we all are in every single interaction, repatterning culture, whether we know it or not. And so, but that process takes such patience and slowness and pause for the reflective process that it requires. And in many ways, lockdown or our experience, and this is quite a privileged stance, could be and may be an opportunity for that. And so again, I suppose just to situate our conversation in time, which we're in quite a unique time, how is it that you are making meaning of COVID and maybe lockdown?
Great question, Al. For me, I decelerated from a very fast life, I would suggest. Last year I counted at the end of the year, 35 countries, every continent, 18 countries for the first time, a bunch that I returned to, 35 different conferences and convenings around the world. It was an outrageous year against any metric. So I've kind of gone from almost living on an airplane to not being on a plane being in the same place for the longest period of time in my last 12 years. And so that's, for me, at a personal level, I have felt like, someone has just slammed on the brakes and I've come to almost a standstill. And so, of course, and I would be quite authentic and vulnerable about this, at first I panicked. I thought, like, what is this? Well, actually, at first I went through the Kubler-Ross models of grief, right? All the stages of grief, I should say, right? From denial, no, it'll be fine. I'll still be able to fly and, do my work at Stanford or go to that conference at High Tech High in San Diego, which were the things I was going to go back to do in March as everything was kind of getting a bit hairy. So denial, and then that was kind of anger, and then sadness, and then bargaining, and finally I got to acceptance. And so once I got to acceptance, that's been the offer. But I've also found myself picking up all these ideas that I thought, that would be interesting to explore. And so I probably overdid it a bit. My greatest strength, and which is also my greatest weakness, and it's probably my relentless curiosity. So I'll be liable to burn out if I'm not careful, because I'll just say yes to everything and just explore the world, and then get to a point where I'm physically, mentally, and relationally exhausted. So that's been there's this great reflection from, I think it's Blaise Pascal. He says most of man's problems comes from his inability to sit in a room alone. And I think there's something to that. And I think if we think about our collective experiences here, not all of us have been sitting in rooms alone. For many, it's been sitting in rooms with their kids, trying to educate their kids. It's been quite a busy time. But there has been something about breaking the patterns of the ways that we've lived, worked, and learned up to this point, up to today, the way we're speaking. And so by that kind of disruption really has created some space for something new to emerge. So it's much harder. We've been talking about moving to digital learning in education for, 25 years more, since the internet was kind of created. And never before have you seen, hundreds of millions of educators just shifting their models, and in some developing countries, of course, that means going to radio or to television. Mexico's is all their students are remote, 30 million, learners, all via TV, and so there's an incredible amount of disruption there. So it means the old patterns have kind of been put on hold or have dissolved. And again, you can talk from an entrepreneurial perspective about the industries that will clearly not survive potentially, and those that will struggle, but also those that have flourished. And yeah, so that's been my personal experience. I'm used to traveling a lot, and so I've had to create space, because the travel for me was an escape. It was a release valve from my relentless curiosity and kind of hyper engagement / intensity, perhaps, right?
Yeah.
So what I've done is I've just tried to create a few rituals and routines here, which I'm now sticking quite well to. Be that going to see the sunset every single night for the first 2 months of lockdown, because thankfully in South Australia we weren't as it wasn't as bad for us here. Or maybe it running through the local scrubland park, and being kind of immersed in nature. Yeah, there's been some really wonderful silver linings once I got to that point of acceptance. And so it's a pondering that I have. And obviously I work mainly in education, trying to support incredibly hardworking educators and leaders and the learners themselves, right, to kind of have agency, co-create a better model, better experience that works for them, all children as whole children. But I also wonder just about the bigger questions around society. How is society changed by this moment? If this is 2025 and you and I are having a similar conversation, it's just such a fascinating thing. Like, how bold will we have been? Will we all just kind of cave in to the desire to go back to some kind of pattern of normality, and return to normal? Not that it exists anymore, but that idea. Or will we try to allow things to slip away that no longer serve us? And so this is a long answer to your point around adaptability, right? Or adaptation. I think we need to hold particular parts of our identity lightly, particularly when it comes to what we do professionally. Perhaps not about our character. I'm pretty clear around the person that I want to be and continue to become. But certainly in terms of, this is Louka, the teacher or educator or entrepreneur or innovator, or this is Louka, the director of this thing for this organization. Those things we have to hold more lightly because of the pace of change and the law of accelerating returns, converging exponential technologies just means that is going to be what work will feel like for all of us into the future. So how do we enable parts of us, it's a bit too extreme, to die, but new parts to be born as we continue to evolve? And I think we make the false assumption, perhaps because we often, including myself, lack the humility, that we will be the same person in 10 years' time with the same thinking. No, we will be very different people. And there's some interesting research that looks at this. When you look back on 10 years, and I don't know about you, Al, but this has felt like 10 years, 2020. So I wonder about, the exponential growth that we all might have experienced. Because in our desire to change the world, we have to start by changing ourselves. And that, I think, is something I'm trying to pay attention to.
Yeah. Yeah. And aren't cliches, in inverted commas, so true in many ways when we really live moments like this, need to condense like profundity into something so accessible, the widget, but to be the change. I'm curious, how do you, for me, the notion of, and for those of you that listen regularly, you would have heard me bring it up quite regularly of late, but the notion of queerness as a way of being, not as an orientation. As someone who identifies as a queer man, my experience of queerness is a philosophy of living. It is holding identity at bay, and it's the convergence of curiosity and identity. For me, that melting pot in between is an experience of queerness. And so, I'm curious what are maybe the personal practices or ways of being, and also social structures, knowing that, who we surround ourselves by is incredibly important in helping us foster either new habits and reinforcing or integrating ways of being. What are some of the things that you either intentionally do or are starting to notice really support the process of holding a sense of openness and willingness to see newness?
Yeah, great question. And I'm that's so interesting around even orientation. Orientations change at the general level, right? The way that we approach anything will shift. It's why when we watch these movies where, there's an adult that kind of gets reincarnated as their high school self, we were so interested in that concept because we think, oh, imagine if I knew now what I knew then. You know, it's kind of this interesting piece. In terms of what I'm noticing, I have a few rituals and routines that I do. I do check-ins with a few really good friends of mine, but they are also friends that will challenge me about my particular patterns or model. So so that just means that I have standing phone calls, every week, basically repeating forever until whatever year it is that I no longer am on this earth. But the idea there is it's trying to get down to the level of being and identity. It's not us talking about, what necessarily, here's the project I'm working on. I've got wonderful colleagues and I'm very lucky to do lots of different work all over the place in that space. It's also about it's getting down to the, not what we know, not what we can do, but who we are. And so, that's how we manifesting, to use that language, right? Which might be a bit vague, but it's like quite literally, like if consciousness is an emergent property, as some consider that it is, what is the presence that I bring when I am interacting with others, in our world? And so that, I think I don't even want to count it up, to be honest, but I probably have about 4 hours of calls, 4 to 5 hours of calls per week that really is around that. And they're standing calls and we try never to miss them, be it on a weekly or fortnightly cadence. The other thing is all about habits. And, as someone that's a Greek Welsh Australian, I've become really fascinated by the Stoics, by philosophy, just generally in the last few years, to be honest. It wasn't anything I had much interest in until I suppose I started asking better questions. And when you start asking better questions, you have to bring in a philosophical frame. It's the point around mental models, right? It's our kind of sometimes quite implicit belief systems, our mental models, our value sets that we're not conscious of. And as Carl Jung said, and I really like this sentiment, particularly if we talk about free will, until we make the unconscious conscious, that it will rule our life and we will call it fate. And I think that's so powerful. It's like, what are we noticing? And so just being able to do that. I mean, the other thing that has happened, I think, for me in the last 3 years is I have really just delved headfirst into the world of social-emotional learning, right? Our life skills. And the reason that's happened is, as an educator, I saw pretty early on that actually it wasn't enough to be just teaching content or even hard skills. Right? It was about the culture of the classroom. It was about young people and my own capacity to self-regulate, my level of self-awareness and self-knowledge, my ability to have kind of social awareness and to make responsible decisions, and then my capacity to continue to learn and to evolve as I develop and I grow. I mean, that's why I am very at home, Al, in education, because I just love the concept of human development and growth and learning so much. So that I think has been really powerful. So I journal every morning as part of I think I called RPM. I'm telling you all this stuff. RPM, which is run, push up, meditation.
Yeah.
And so I don't run every day, but I definitely do max push-ups and then a 20-minute meditation, and then I journal. And what I do at the end of that journal is I write 3 things, just a reflection of what's present for me. What am I noticing? How am I responding? A little bit of ACT, acceptance commitment theory, basically, the model. And then I do, who do I want to be today? And I write 3 words. How am I going to enable myself to be that person? And what are the things I do need to do? In fact, it's not even what are the things I do need. It's what are the things I get to do? Very subtle reframe, right? But I am probably master at the positive cognitive reframe. I'm so good at it. And it's because I'm an optimist by nature as well, as well as nurture. So anyway, very long answer, but I think, 3 things: having standing calls where I do an emotional check-in, just as we did actually before this conversation. What's present? How am I responding? Does it align to kind of the life path that I want to walk or that I want to move towards? Number 2 is just the really strong rituals and routines that I have every single morning. I try to do them rain, hail, or shine. So that's powerful. Number 3 is just, the fields that I've started to investigate are the ones that are more and more human, I would say, by nature. The idea of how do we understand the human condition? How do we understand growth and development? And how do we create that the most powerful, the most optimal, and the kind of, in a sense of wholeness of growth for our employees in companies, our students in schools, our staff in schools, our friends and family in our lives. Because I really feel that's the highest calling for all of us, is to really see people and to evolve together towards whatever they might be after.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks for sharing, Louka's 101. RPM.
RPM, yeah, I know.
Yeah. Love it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Kind of similar to me as well. And I definitely notice, which leads into my next question, but notice at times where I am, Martin Buber, a philosopher, who talks about the I-thou relationship and the I-it and the I-you. I notice at times how my practices, I treat them with the I-it relationship. It's just another thing on my list of things to do. And I just got to check off. For me, it's MBBE, mind with breath, breath with body, breath with body with earth.
Wow.
And that's and then it's journaling and just writing for basically an hour. But I notice when that becomes an I-it relationship and I objectify my practices and I'm just getting them done. And then to bring the I-thou is to treat them with a quality of attention around, reverence and sacredness. And it totally shifts the frame of the practice, which brings me to, I suppose a topic we were touching on earlier, the kind of almost the whitewashing of these practices. And it can be meditation, it can be journaling, it can be even socio-emotional development and learning, where it is just because we read an article in Psychology Today or something that said this improves productivity or our ability to be creative or to develop psychological safety, which the output of that is greater innovation and adaptability. But bringing in the piece around, social reform or transformative justice. Yeah, and there's many questions around that. But I suppose one that I'm curious about is, for you, what helped you shift, I suppose, the frame from your being in the world being for maybe from an egocentricity to an ecocentricity. What for you helped that flip? Because it's a lot of work to kind of feel our practices as a contribution, as our kind of dharma in the world. It's a great shift that many of us need to take. But to shift from that need to take it to the real desire to, that inner pull, what was it that shifted there for you? And I'm sure there's many points, but is there any that you could note?
That's a really great question. And Al, I think that's probably the foundational question that we're all, that I've come to, is how do we move away from, do we call it the self-delusion, or do we call it egocentricity, towards an ecological approach, one in which we see ourselves as an integral part. And I'll pick up a couple of three main things in my life so far. And I'm sure there's going to be 30 more probably on this journey. The first was leaving Australia as an 18-year-old and moving to Dublin in Ireland for 6 months, and then traveling across Europe for a year. And this was effectively a rite of passage for me post high school. Primary school, my memories are quite sour from primary school, but in high school, I certainly flourished, in terms of being able to try all these cool skills and do music and drama and sport and academics, whatever. But what I realized is, having grown up in Adelaide, when I moved to Europe, I realized the role that education had played in my life. And, I come from two families, one that has kind of had, university education in its history for a long time, and the other, for whom my mum was the first in her family to go to university, for example. And my yaya was illiterate, actually, and went to school for 2 days, but just loved education so much that all I needed to do was show up and get a certificate, and it was like, it's a celebration forever. So that year and a half spent moving and working, traveling, backpacking across Europe, I know that it's another cliche, but certainly it was expansive in terms of my own understanding. I had a pretty limited view of the world as a 17-year-old man, which probably isn't all that surprising. But certainly when I returned, at 19 and then went to university, I had a very different view of the world. And I realized the interconnectedness, and almost not a desire, but a responsibility to learn about the history of our world from a cultural perspective, as well as just from a factual one. What is it that I should pay attention to? And that was also quite intricately tied up into the old, with my own story through my immigrant parents, right, that came to Australia in the 60s by boat and their experiences. And so, going back and traveling to the old village where Yaya grew up, or visiting the town where Dad's dad was from, it was really empowering for me, grounded me into, I'm actually part of the world. I'm not just part of a small neighborhood in a city, delightful city, mind you, in Adelaide, over here in SA. So that was the first piece. The second piece was after, going through university, and I was working and traveling, like at every single opportunity at that point, I started to dive into my own linguistic ancestry. I didn't speak Greek as a young kid, so I started learning modern Greek from the beginners 101 at university as a 19-year-old. And I did the same thing with Spanish, and ended up living in Latin America for 9 months on exchange, and then going to Greece as well for a month on exchange. And that exploration of language as well, and the way that language and culture is just so beautifully connected, also started to give me access to, it was a discovery into, what you might have heard of, sometimes they're called windows and mirrors, right? So, sometimes it can mirror you back, parts of who we are linguistically and, in terms of identity, but also we look into the world of others. And if you do language as well with culture, and are culturally responsive, you can even walk through the door and try, to take perspective. So I think my perspective now that was incredibly influential in getting to my perspective now. And then, but the second piece was then I moved to remote Australia. And, initially, this is a remote community of 350 people. And I went out as a brand new teacher, shiny, enthusiastic, directionless. No, I'm just kidding. But it was, that was definitely a baptism of fire. As being your first year of teaching is anywhere. It is just an incredibly complex role. I mean, I like saying that, teaching isn't rocket science. It's far more complicated than that, because it's human development, which is dynamic and unpredictable. And there aren't simple formulas that we can follow. So spending 5.5 years out there alongside Anangu, learning from them and with them, an incredibly paradigm shifting time in my life, right? It's literally, it shifted me. I'm this white, Southern European, Welsh, like Celtic kind of mixture. And I didn't know very much about the true history of our First Peoples. And I take that now as a responsibility, and that we do need to do more to do that, to embed that into our society as Australians. We should be incredibly proud that is our history. Acknowledge the dark genocidal past and the aspects of that, and then build, like with that recognition, build forward together in a way where we celebrate the beautiful diversity of this country. And so that 5.5 years, really I challenged a lot. I challenged a lot about, my sense of privilege in particular. I got a glimpse into what it feels like to be a minority, playing for the football team as the only white guy on occasions. And, and how looking different and not understanding the language and being kind of a cultural outsider, what that feels like. And I think that's a really powerful experience, particularly for someone like me, an educated white male in Australian society. That's a really powerful experience to have. So that's the second piece. And that, I'm just incredibly grateful for that chapter in particular. But the third is probably this idea of what I've realized in kind of working now across the globe in international and comparative education and, training and speaking and whatever it is I do. And that's the idea about the cult of efficiency. And I mean, you and I might even talk about the cult of entrepreneurship. And I think there are deeply unhealthy aspects to that, which is the hustle culture, and I think it comes from just the wrong metrics being in place, right? Which is, how long you work, as in being a metric. It's not a useful metric. It's, how much are you contributing to the world is the better question to ask. And so I've realized that a couple of times just through kind of burnout. And I've gotten to a point where I'm like, who am I doing this for? And I've realized that I don't even know anymore if I'm doing this for my own self-discovery or if I'm doing it for a kind of concept around status, or frankly, the achievement paradigm that I was stuck in, I would say as well, for a lot of my life. If you get praised for what you do, then it reinforces the behavior. So you do more, and then it's about what you achieve, not necessarily about who you are.
Yeah.
Beyond achievement, like the not doing or the non-doing, right? So those are the three things I would say, I suppose, that have been pretty impactful on my life to this point. But I've even, I don't even know if I've answered your question in that exploration, but I certainly reflected on that.
Yeah. And thanks for sharing. And they pull on, there are many threads that kind of pull us culturally out of relationship with the whole, but your three sharings then really touch on a couple that I know for me have been really influential as well. And one is the conditions of worth we build up, looking at it from maybe kind of Carl Rogers and a humanistic approach. And I know for me, my work being related to my worth somehow is a massive one. And I sense for many of us. So that being a massive thread. And then I suppose connecting with our own experience of injustice and inequality and being a minority group. And so for me, it's been a real time, and this lockdown as well, to really tend to my own internal injustices and to really sit with how I've introjected shame or guilt or whatever, anger, whatever it may have been, against myself on the inside, and let that be let that sadness, which may show up as anger or whatever, but let that be the fuel for not the fuel for my work in the world, but fuel for my empathy, to really feel it in my own being in the world first. I suppose just really a real humility, a real humus, kind of landing in, the soil of our own experiences. So I love, that it seems like and this is something I always reflect on, that in a sense, we're all pulling on a common pool of emotion or collective experience. We have our own very personal experience or manifestation of these emotions. But deeply, when we really connect with our own, what Martin Buber would call our deep being, that being that maybe for some resides in the navel or Dantian or elsewhere, when we connect with that, we are able to really sense our sameness. And from that place, live in relationship. Yeah.
That's really powerful. I wonder about consciousness development as well in this whole piece. And, to pull on some of Harari's musings, which are fairly good, I think. The idea that we're making all of these investments into artificial intelligence and roboticization, trillions of dollars, right, across the world into these emerging technologies that will be phenomenal at doing things that we can currently do, particularly in terms of narrow intelligence. General intelligence is a bit more complex. But for every dollar that we spend in that space, how many dollars are we spending around raising our own human consciousness? Because, and I don't know if you've seen this reflection by kind of a prominent climate scientist, and he says, we know what needs to be done to, ensure that we live within our planetary bounds, so that we kind of integrate, that we maximize well-being. We know what needs to be done. But what we don't know how to do is to change people's value sets or mental models so that we can actually do those particular things. That is the big unknown. And I'm really interested in this work. And for me, of course, it's around not schooling, but education, right? So it's, and potentially, lifelong and life-wide learning. And this is kind of the work that I often talk about is, if our future is to be anything, it will be a learning future, because this is a journey. The journey never ends. And we've it's this strange assumption that we make that when we get there, we will feel this way. And that's really not the case. It's kind of, there is the present moment and nothing else, So it's like the interim is the actual response. Yeah. So that's, that's an interesting piece to consider.
Yeah. Yeah. The real Stoics. I love the frame in Stoicism to shift our perspective from the pursuit of an objective to the quality of the virtues the qualities of the virtues that we extol in the pursuit.
Display, extol. Yeah, that's beautiful. This is probably where my learning edge is at the moment, right? In terms of presencing and the kind of theory you work. Now, what I'm interested in is, what is it about us? What is it about all of us at particular moments where we have incredible presence? We can talk about flow from psychology, for example. We can talk about just, transformational leaders. What is it? It's not actually what they do and say. It is that, but it's more than that. It's and it's not just Maya Angelou's phrase. It's it's how they make you feel. It's true, but it's who they are being that enables that. And I'm really interested in that. Both because I want to contribute as much as I can while I can, but also because I think it's something, if we paid attention to that, and if this moment, Al, isn't the moment of leadership, there isn't a moment of leadership.
No.
Like how can we be truly bold, inclusive as we quite literally reconstruct our societies through, a recession, which it will be your first recession of your lifetime. I was a couple of years old when it first happened, So there's something really powerful about the role of a leader in this space as well. And how this great reflection, we're all waiting for someone or for something, and what if we considered that we are the people we're waiting for, and we took that kind of agency that we have, we reclaimed it. And we're seeing this around the world now, be it through Black Lives Matter or other movements saying, the right is the language of the unheard, to quote, Martin Luther King. And so, that I think is our great challenge for this point, and the intersection of both who we are as social and emotional and cognitive being. And, in one of my big things that I continue to try to advocate for is how do we elevate the social and the emotional alongside that cognitive? Because when we bring all those things together into the wholeness, we stop segmenting and segregating, and we start to integrate and fuse, be transdisciplinary instead of monodisciplinary. I think that will lead us towards, I'm trying to answer this big question, right? I think that will lead us towards a greater awareness of how we are all in this together, and therefore changes in the way that we make our decisions.
Yeah, just the notion of living as a question rather than a statement. I mean, for me, and in a very similar way, have a very wide curiosity. And it just in the last week, I've been really doing a big integrity cleanse and just really sitting with what have I said yes to that deep down is actually a no, and therefore I need to communicate and exit from that commitment. And how can I deepen my ability to sense a fuck yes? And if it's not, then it's not. And I need to have the courage to communicate that very clearly and as early as possible. But that's tangent.
That's pretty useful. That's
having a very wide curiosity can often end up very caught up in looking for the answers amidst many of my threads of, curious inquiry. But David White often reminds me to live as a question rather than as a statement. And what does it mean to inhabit yourself as a question? To show up in relationship as a question mark rather than a full stop, which I absolutely love as the, just a reminder that we are a living inquiry. There is absolutely no need to show up with the answer or to someday have the answer. And in some sense, that's the humility that, I don't know, it softens me into the web of life, is to understand that, I'm just part of, and I'm not even, I was going to say the answer, but there is none. I'm just part of this beautiful happening. Yeah.
That's great. That's really great. I hadn't heard that reflection before, actually.
Yeah.
So that's one thing I'm definitely taking away is how do we live our lives as a question and not as a statement? And I think, again, maybe that integrates into leadership. Great leaders ask great questions. They don't tell people what to do. It doesn't work that way.
No.
Even if it ever did. So, I think it's only through questioning can we actually grow and develop. As soon as we think we are static, we start to crystallize, solidify. Our groove becomes the rut. And this, I think, is totally around the future of work and the future of learning, is that if we consider ourselves a question and we don't ever say, this is who I am forever, that enables us to be agile and adaptable, which are, in my view, features of the future workforce, or the future of society as well. Is us just having to go like, with almost some non-attachment, go like, well, I've lost my job, but that's okay because I can do this instead,
Yeah.
Because I back my ability to continue to learn and unlearn and relearn.
Yeah.
Which,
Yeah.
That's
so
great.
Maybe as a way of closing, what is a question you might leave listeners with that you find a really great check-in question, and maybe contextually to this time as well?
So, it's really powerful. So here's my offer. And it's an offer to myself, right? Because I'd never say something to someone else that I wouldn't want for myself. And that's to pay attention to the person we want to be. And based on that, at the deepest level, then think about what we need to do and what do we need to know. And I think that's the kind of character foundation that I think is done really well in some organizations and in some schools. It's a focus on the virtues. It's the character traits, the curiosity, the kindness, the gratitude, the compassion, the things we know about that make a good human being. All the hard skills and the other stuff that will come after, but it should be a subsequent consideration. And what we've done is we've kind of done this Faustian bargain in some ways, where we've lost that wholeness to the idea of a clear standardization where we can articulate with clarity and confidence the validity of this particular measure. And I think maybe human development isn't that black and white. Maybe it's just so much more about who are we, what can we do, or who are we, who do we want to be, what do we want to do with who we are, and then what do we need to know. And that's part of my morning routine, which is, and I try to start with that rather than writing the list of all the things and your idea of the objective thing around that. How do I embed those things into my being? Because when I do that, all of us can create extraordinary contribution, I think, in our work, through our relationships, through whatever way we contribute to the world.
Thank you. Yeah. Any other closing invitations or, to bring that sense of wholeness or resolution to our...
Well, something more practical, particularly for this current moment, is before you ask someone, what do you think? Maybe we should ask them, how do you feel? And it's only because we have over time forgotten that we are emotional beings that think rather than thinking beings that feel. Right. So we've kind of just thought academics and intellect and the academy is all that matters. They matter greatly, but only in context, only in wholeness. And again, this aligns to anything about the future of work and frankly, our employability, our ability to create value. But it also, I think, is exactly what we need for this age of anxiety right now, to use the Alan Watts subtitle of the book, right? If we are in the age of anxiety, there's no doubt about that. It is the primary emotion that people are experiencing right now. And so checking in with yourself and then also helping yourself regulate by checking in with trusted others, even, with professional others, if that's part of what you want to do. I think it's absolutely crucial for all of us to be thriving human beings. And we need to embed it into our societal structures, I think, as well, as much as possible, to be preventionist and not interventionist, as the saying goes. So how do you feel right now? Take a deep breath and then help process those emotions in the most healthy way possible for you. And that's something I try to live by as I go through the roller coaster that is 2020 alongside all of us.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for dancing in the inquiry together. There's so many threads that we could continue, and maybe we will.
I hope we do at some point, Al.
Yeah. Where's the best place for people to connect with you? And we'll put it in the show notes.
Well, anywhere. Like Louka, Parry. My first name is spelled in the Greek way. It's quite unique. So it's Louka and Parry. And of course, I have like a presence on LinkedIn. Probably LinkedIn, to be honest, or check out thelearningfuture.com, which is where I do a bunch of my work in education primarily, but not solely. Yeah, but I'm trying to be very considered with my use of social media, particularly now around how do we change some of the patterns that we might have become in our life. But would love to chat with you again, Al, and deeply aligned on a lot of our musings, I think, and wish everyone well.
What questions are still whirring inside for you? What landed and rung loudly for you? Let's take a moment. Thank you for joining me for another life-affirming and enriching conversation, each one a light, a torch to guide us on our path to being in right relationship with ourselves, those we walk with, and the ecologies we are very much a part of. I trust this has gifted you something to place in your toolkit to support you in your journey and your leadership. Make sure to connect with me and leave any comments on my Facebook or Instagram page at @ljeffrey, and check out the links in the show notes. This show is completely funded by listeners just like you, so if you feel generous and wish to be part of nourishing these inquiries that we're exploring together, you can leave a once-off donation or soon subscribe to my Patreon membership. Show notes, resources, and donations are all at www.spacesbetweenpodcast.com. Until next time, remember, we can't rush our way back. Notice connections and tend to the sweet, sweet spaces between. Lots of love.